Good evening. Well, thank you. I said it was kind of nice tonight. I don't often get to eat at a dinner, and I got to eat tonight a little bit too as well. So to be here in Florida, to be at Disney, I was telling Anthony that my kids are now 17 and 18, but I've been here plenty of times in the past, so much so that for those of you who come from a distance, who come as visitors, you know, if you really want to work it out well, I said you stay on property so you can get it at 9 o'clock, an hour before everybody else, and you make sure if your kids are young, you come back and take a nap midway through the day, and then you're set so that you can come back and make it all the way through the fireworks at night. So it's always a lot of fun to be down here. And I realized, I think I came probably about a year or so, year and a half after Disney World opened for the first time. We liked it so much. At that time, I was still a kid in Plainfield, Iowa, until we moved a couple years later to Delavan, where I spent most of the rest of my childhood. But we liked it so much that our family, my dad was a minister, and the parsonage was right next door, and we literally transformed our house into Disney World with all the different things, and had all the kids over, and it was a great time. So it's always great not only to come to Florida, but to come to Orlando and relive some of those moments in my own childhood as well as my kids. It's an honor to be here as well. I appreciated the distinction in the introduction, though, because I remember last year, not long before I was at that U.S. Chamber of Commerce meeting, I was in Washington, and I was doing something with biosciences and a number of other governors there, and Rick Scott was there, and Rick Scott was on CNBC, and there was a break, and then I went on CNBC right after that in Squawk Box. And back then, they didn't obviously know either of us that well, because when they went from Rick's name underneath, they didn't change it completely, so then when I came on here, it said Governor Rick Scott Walker. And they had it completely messed up. They don't make that mistake anymore, although thankfully Rick and I got to know each other a couple years ago, literally right after the November 2010 election. I didn't know Rick and Ann, but Tonette and I got to meet them at a couple things for new governors, first with Republican governors and then with all the National Governors Association, and really admire them. It's been a great year for them, not just in the things they've done here, but they've got a new grandchild, and they've been having a great year and enjoying things. I just saw Rick 2 weeks ago in Texas, where he and I and Rick Perry talk about another day where we were on Fox and Friends that morning doing the show together, and it was Rick Perry, Scott Walker, and Rick Scott. Talk about an announcer that tried to figure out, now is it Rick or Scott or Perry or what's the deal there? But each of us were talking about trying to turn our states around and get the economy going again. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we did, but I appreciate working with Governor Scott and with a lot of other great governors across this country who are trying to do some of the same things we tried to do in Wisconsin. And I particularly appreciate, I was looking, I mean, this is great intel, to put the great seal of the state of Wisconsin. And this is not a political event tonight, so I'm not going to talk about partisan political politics or candidates, but I do want you to look at the top and realize we had forward in 1848. In fact, the day you referenced the swearing in on January 3rd of 2011, and it was kind of interesting. That day, I did things a little different. I've done things a little differently as the governor, but in our capital, of course, in January, we have our swearing in inside the Capitol. You can imagine why. Just knowing today in October, coming here was about a 40-degree increase in the temperature for me than where I was. It's not always that cold in Wisconsin. As plenty here know, it's wonderful during the summer months and even for the next month or two. But in January, obviously, it's very cold, and so we're inside the Capitol. And historically, the governor's sworn in front of the East Wing, because that's where the Capitol, the governor's office is in the Capitol. And I chose to move it. Now, there were some cynics that said I chose to move it because the governor normally is sworn in front of a bust of Bob La Follette, who was the leader of the modern-day progressive movement. There may be some truth to that, but the real reason I moved it was because the state's constitution is around the corner. And I was thinking of that as I saw our seal flash up there for a moment. The reason I moved it there was I wanted to reference a part of our state's constitution that goes all the way back to May of 1848 that's never been altered, never been amended. It's one of the few parts that's never been touched in our state's constitution. It's called the Frugality Clause. And on that day, more than a year and a half ago, I stood in our rotunda and pointed out to the people of our state that what was great about that Constitution, that was a guide for us from generations past, was that it talked about the proper role of government. It didn't talk about it in terms of Republican or Democrat, liberal, conservative. It simply said that moderation and frugality in government leads to freedom and prosperity for our people. So those were important words. Well, you can clap for that. Sure, that's all right. Not only in our state's history, but those are important words back then, but more importantly, they were important words at that time. Now, little did I know how prophetic those words would be. In fact, a few months earlier, after the November 2nd, 2010 elections, I had met for the first time Rick Scott, as well as other new governors who got together out in San Diego for a meeting of the Republican Governors Association. And all of us newly elected governors, as well as the ones who'd been in office before, gathered at this meeting. One of those, we had a breakfast meeting, which we'll have in a couple weeks after the election, similar to that one, with hopefully some new governors as well. But at that particular meeting, all the current governors who were in office went around the table and gave suggested pieces of insight or perspective to all of us who had just been elected. And for me, there were two people I looked to, one who was still in office, one who'd been in office, kind of as role models. One was Mitch Daniels, who was there and said something to us. I'll repeat in a moment. The other was Jeb Bush. I look at what Jeb Bush did here years ago when he first came into office and turned things around, not only in terms of the economic climate, but in terms of education reform and all the other wonderful things that came out of the Bush administration in the state. And I said, those are the sorts of things I'd like to replicate in the state of Wisconsin. The other one was Mitch Daniels, who I just saw yesterday at the Colts-Packers game down in Indianapolis. But Mitch said something, as he often does, in a very dry sense of humor, but with absolute seriousness attached to it. He said, all of you new governors, just let me tell you something. Your political capital will be the highest on the day you take office, and it will go down proportionally every day thereafter. He said, it doesn't seem like the right thing to do, he said, but let me forewarn you that because of that simple reality, you need to understand that you gain political capital not by hoarding it, but by using it. He said, don't blink. Now, we got together last November after I'd gone through all this in Wisconsin, and it was the same group of governors together, and I reminded them all what Mitch had said. I said, apparently all you new guys, I listened more closely than Mitch, than anybody else did to Mitch's comments. But in our case, it really applies to what we did. You see, when we were running for governor, I treated our campaign like a job interview. Like any of you who applied for a job at any point in your career, I went in and talked to the interview committee, which were the voters of the state of Wisconsin. And I pointed out that we had an economic and a fiscal crisis. And then I told the voters what I was going to do to fix it. And then when we got into office that January, we didn't wait a year or 6 months or a month, because any of you who've taken over businesses that are failing, you've taken them on, you bought out a subsidiary, you brought something in on there, you don't wait a year or 6 months, you act on it right away, right? Well, that's what we did. We didn't wait. And that kind of shocked the media, because we didn't wait and we actually did what we said we were going to do. When we knew if we were going to turn things around, we had to have a dynamic effect. In fact, I remember one of the fun things I did, and we were talking about Chicago and Illinois before. There's been a lot of contrast in the last year and a half or so between Wisconsin and Illinois, not the least of which was right when I took office, there are big signs in the state line that say, Wisconsin welcomes you. And historically, there's always a little shingle underneath that has the name of the governor. Well, early last year, I replaced that, but instead of putting my name up there, all I put was open for business. Because I wanted to send a strong message that something had changed. There was a new attitude, not only for people coming into our state, but for businesses that were already there, because that's our bread and butter. In any state, your best opportunity for growth is with existing employers in the state that you help grow and make feel better about where they're at. Not just about attracting new ones in. Hey, we'll take them if they want to come in, but the ones that we already have are the ones that are our best customers. I paid my way through college working at IBM, some warranty agreements back before they even started selling them on mainframes, and we always said 3/4 or more of your business should come from existing clients because they know you and trust you. You've already built a bridge. You just got to make sure you take care of them and bring them back home, and then the rest of it should come from new clients out there. That's the same thing, I think, at least when it comes to state government. Attracting businesses in, the best way you can attract business in is by making the ones you have feel better about the environment that they have in their state. And so we acted on it right away. Literally within the first 4 to 5 weeks, I called that first day of special session, where we not only challenged, in fact, that January 3rd, I gave my Attorney General the legal authority to go out and join the federal lawsuit challenging Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, because of the great, grave concern I heard from employers in my state who were worried about what the future was going to hold with the unknown of what was going to happen from the mandates from the federal government. But on top of that, we called a special session and said, okay, here's what we got to do. We got to realize that the best way to help people create jobs in the state is let the people of the state create the jobs, not the government. So we decided to get the government out of the way. We lowered the tax burden right away. We streamlined the regulatory process, so what we enforce is about common sense, not about bureaucratic red tape. We passed something I know the Chamber here is working on very significantly to help improve the business climate, and that is we passed the most aggressive tort reform in the country, realizing that regulation and litigation costs were a major barrier to our employers, big and small and everywhere in between, and that one of the best things we could do would be to lower those costs of frivolous and out-of-control lawsuits and excessive regulation. We did that right away. In fact, we did it so significantly, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce this last year at our Chamber of Commerce's meeting gave us a national award for the work that we've done in the state of Wisconsin. We knew if we did those things, and we did other things as well. We repealed the state tax on health savings accounts, knowing that wasn't the sole solution, but for small businesses and family farmers that wanted one more option, we didn't think there should be a state tax on HSAs. We did all those things right away. And the good news is it had results. Mentioned in the introduction, to highlight that, it was actually the Chamber of all entities that did the survey that 2 years ago said that 10% of our employers thought we had in the right direction, 94% today. I'm competitive, so I want to know what's wrong with the other 6%. Maybe they got union contracts or something like that. I don't know, but we're trying to make sure we get even more than 94% in the future. But we also saw in our rankings nationwide, historically in our state, we never talked about those rankings of the top and the worst states because we were in the bottom. We were in the bottom 10. In fact, 2 years before I took office, we were 43. The year before I took office, we were 41. Last year, after our first phase of reforms went into place, we went from 41 to 24. This year, we moved up to 20, and on CNBC's ranking, we're number 17. And so we're consistently moving towards the top. Now, we're not there yet, but not bad for less than 2 years. We think we've got to fundamentally change the environment so that our employers within the state, as well as others looking at it, know that Wisconsin is a good place to do business in. It's just a fundamental change of heart. Now, along with that, I think one of the other things, though, that's important at both the state and the local level really goes to the heart of the reforms that most people know us the best about, and that is tackling your fiscal crisis as well. We inherited a $3.6 billion budget deficit per capita, one of the biggest we've ever had. Our state's about 5.7 million people, so $3.6 billion is a pretty big budget deficit. Per capita, it was one of the biggest in the country, one of the biggest in our state's history. And we knew to balance it, we had to do it in a sound way. And so we didn't rely on tax increases. We didn't rely on massive layoffs. We didn't rely on cuts in things like Medicaid. Instead, what we did was put in place long-term structural reforms that not just at the state, but at the local level, helped us to balance not our budget, not just for today, but for generations to come. In fact, one of the most important things I said to lawmakers in our state last year when we were going through this is we need to think more about the next generation than we do about the next election. And isn't it what you elect people to do? Think more about the next generation than we do about the next election. In our case, the path towards doing that was simple. And in fact, it's an interesting contrast to our neighbors to the south in Illinois. You see, Wisconsin, Illinois, Florida, a lot of states across this country, nearly every one, had a budget deficit last year, in part because of the economy, in part because of poor decisions made in the past. And so we decided we were going to do it one way. We decided we were going to do it without raising taxes. Illinois, for example, decided they were going down a different path. They raised taxes 67% on individuals, 46% on businesses. How about that for a business environment in the state of Illinois? A year later, after raising all that supposed revenue, they found out that their business climate not only stinks, but on top of that, they didn't balance their budget. Why? Because when you raise taxes that much, what happened instead was that jobs and wealth left the state, and now they have to make up for it. In fact, it got so bad that some of their bigger employers like Sears and Caterpillar threatened to leave, and so the governor and the legislature had to come back in and carve them out of the tax increase, pushing an even higher burden on the rest of the employers in the state. You look in contrast, they're now in such a problem with their state budget, they're literally proposing closing 14 state facilities, laying off thousands of public employees, cutting more than $1 billion out of Medicaid. And on top of all that, you probably saw in the last month or so, 2 of the national bond rating agencies have lowered theirs to the worst bond rating in the country, even lower than California's, if you can imagine. And they have a pension system that's only half funded. In contrast, in our state, we chose to go down a different path. We put in place these structural reforms that basically put the power back in the hands of the taxpayers. There's a lot of talk about pensions and health care, and that was part of it. But what we did is said there's no more collective bargaining for anything except base salary, and even that is capped off at the CPI. The idea being that for the taxpayers, if times are tough, that employees like myself in the public sector have to share in that sacrifice. If times are good, then those employees can potentially share in the benefits of that. But it's going to be the taxpayers and the people that the taxpayers duly elect at the state and the local level who are going to make those decisions, not the big government unions, not the big government union bosses. And in doing so, we really changed the dynamics of power in our state. In doing so, we were able to take that deficit, which in our state, every state's a little bit different in terms of how they set up their budget, but in our state, about 60% of our budget is aid to local governments. About 45% of the total budget is just to schools. The remaining 15% of that mix is to counties and municipalities. Having been a local official at the county level for 8 years, I knew that if you just cut back on aid to balance the budget, because that's the biggest part out there, without giving local governments any tools, it would be devastating. But if you change collective bargaining, you could put the power back in the hands of the people. Now, in our state, we could change it through the statutes. Indiana did this years ago under Mitch Daniels, just for state employees. We did it for everybody, but just for state employees. And Mitch Daniels was fortunate enough, he could do it through an executive order because that's how it had been put in place in the first place. In my case, I wish I could have done it through an executive order. It probably would have saved about 100,000 visitors to my capital. But although I said it was a pretty good trade-off, because once we got this all completed, I figured I sent 14 senators down to hide out in Illinois. 100,000 people came up and stayed in hotel rooms and bought food at our restaurants. And from a tourism standpoint, it was a pretty good deal. In fact, at one point, I had a friend of mine in Congress gave me a great bumper sticker after we got this all completed. It said, "One walker beats 14 runners." So I got a kick out of that as well. But along the way, we weren't able to do it through an executive order. We had to do it through the statutes. Some people have asked, even folks I know down here in Florida have asked, well, why could you do it here? Well, in your case, it goes beyond just the statutes. You've got to change it, if you ever were to change it, through the Constitution. Because it's not just a statutorily defined issue, it's within the Constitution. But it's one to consider at some point in the future because, again, not only for fiscal, but for other reasons as well, you'd rather, I think I would, I certainly did in my state, I think you would want to have the taxpayers be the ones who are in charge, not a handful of people who run the unions be in charge, because ultimately, the taxpayers should be the ones that prevail, and that's what we did. We showed in our reforms, in fact, I remember at the end of my recall campaign, the last couple months I'd go around to rallies, and I would say to the people at those rallies, does anybody remember what the recall is all about? And the reason was simple. You see, even though they collected nearly 1 million signatures, even though they brought in people from all across the country, even though they spent, as was mentioned, about $80 million on the recall election, in the end, they didn't talk about collective bargaining, and the reason was simple. Our reforms worked. We documented at the beginning of this year, back in January, we had documented more than $1 billion worth of savings from our reforms. That helped for the first time in 12 years, property taxes actually went down on a median valued home in the state of Wisconsin instead of going up as they historically had done. And because of that, as I mentioned before, we went from a $3.6 billion budget deficit to a surplus. In fact, not only a surplus, but for the first time ever in our state's history, in 2 consecutive years, we set money aside in our rainy day fund. Never happened before. Now, because of that, unlike states like Illinois, not only did we avoid tax increases, we didn't have massive layoffs of public employees. We didn't cut Medicaid. In fact, we actually added to Medicaid to care for needy families and children and seniors, more money than any governor in the history of the state of Wisconsin put in, and per capita last year, more money than just about any governor in the country. We did all those things, and most important, well, not most importantly, but equally as important, compared to states like Illinois and California and others out there, the bond rating agencies called our budget credit positive. They gave us a stable recommendation, and our pension system is the best funded in America. We showed that you can make fundamental structural reforms work. But the most important thing we did, and one of the things to think about, not just in Florida, but anywhere across the country, when you think about putting the power back in the hands of the hardworking taxpayers, isn't just about the economic or the fiscal impact. Economic and fiscal reform is great, but the most lasting legacy of what our reforms did comes in government reform, particularly in public education. You see, one of the things I like best about what we did is we empowered at both the state and the local level, we empowered us as elected officials to go out and better serve the people we represent. See, for years, I don't know how it is, I would imagine it's like this in Florida. I remember hearing my grandparents move down to Fort Myers back at the end of the 60s. That's part of the reason why I was able to come down to Disney, because we stayed at their place for a little bit before coming over here to Orlando. But I remember hearing plenty of other friends who've come down throughout the years, and whether it's here or elsewhere, there's a lot of similarities across the country. But I used to say for years in my state, there was always a false choice in government between raising taxes or cutting core services. In fact, public education was a classic example. I've got two boys. Last year when I was debating this, both sons were at Wauwatosa East High School, a public school just outside of the city of Milwaukee. Tonette and I have a home in Wauwatosa, and so as property taxpayers, we always pitted against ourselves. Either our property taxes had to go up as we were told, or our schools would suffer. Now, I was used to point out that's a false choice. None of you in business says, you know what, times are tough, so I'm going to double the price of my product. Or people run to your competitor, right? Or they say, well, you know, times are really tough, I'm going to cut the quality in half. Because people would run to your competitor then as well. And yet, that's the false choice. Here in Wisconsin, across America, overwhelmingly we're expected to just assume is going to happen in government. And public education is one of those classic examples. My belief was, and is even more so today, it's not about spending more money, it's about spending your money more wisely. Let me give you two examples. In Wisconsin, before collective bargaining reform, nearly every school district in my state had to buy their health insurance from just one company. The company just happened to be affiliated with the teachers union. After our reforms, they could bid out that health insurance, and that has literally saved our school districts tens of millions of dollars, money that can go right back into the classroom. That's not about making teachers and school employees pay more for their health insurance. That's about literally saying, why not bid it out, use the free market, free enterprise system, and find a better price? And they did overwhelmingly. I grew up in a small town called Delavan, Wisconsin. Actually, it's about 15 miles down the road from Janesville, where Paul Ryan lives. I laugh when Mitt Romney says that Janesville is a small town, because my town was about 7,000. Janesville is about 60,000. For us, a big night on Friday nights was going to Shakey's to get some pizza and then go to the mall in Janesville. But when I grew up, you know, Delavan was a relatively small school district, and yet that district this year saved almost $1 million just by bidding out their health insurance because of our reforms. In bigger districts like Milwaukee, which is a traditional urban district, which is one of the few whose contracts won't be up until next June, they're estimating their ability to save almost $40 million just by bidding out their health insurance. Think about that for real reform. But the reforms we did are even more important than just the financial or budgetary savings. So I'll tell you another story about Milwaukee. 2 years ago, when I was first running, before I was the governor, there was a young woman, Miss Sampson, in the Milwaukee public school system, who was named the outstanding teacher of the year in the entire state of Wisconsin. A great teacher, very involved with her students, very involved with her parents, really dynamic, just the kind of teacher any of us would want at any of our schools anywhere across America, but exactly the kind of teacher we want in a troubled urban district. Well, she got notice. She got notice about a week and a half later, not of when the date was for the ceremony to receive her award. She got notice she was being laid off. Why? Well, because they were short with money even before I became governor, and so what did they do? Under the old system of collective bargaining, if you were the last hired, you're the first fired. If you're the last in, you're the first out. One of the great achievements of our reforms we can do anywhere in America, are simply put, if you reform the system and you put in place the power back in the hands of the people who are elected and appointed duly at the local level by the taxpayers to do the things that are right for the people of that community or that state, you're going to make great decisions. And one of the best things that most people, not only in my state but across America, don't know about our reforms is today in Wisconsin, we don't have seniority or tenure. That means we can hire and fire based on merit. We can pay based on performance. We can put the best and the brightest in our classrooms, and we can keep them there, and we can pay them for the good work that they do for our students. That is fundamentally important. That's particularly important because over the last year, we've also put in place the kind of measurements that you had, for example, with Jeb's plan here, with the A+ plan for education, where we measure achievement in our schools so that we know the success rate of every school and every school district and every educator in this state so that we can truly measure success, so that we can replicate success in our great schools, and we can find a way to mentor and improve success in those that are failing, and for those that continue to fail, we can find someplace else to send our kids. Because my fundamental belief is, whether it's in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, whether it's in Orlando, Florida, or anywhere else across America, we should have a system in place, particularly when it comes to education, whether it's in our traditional public schools, whether it's in charter schools or choice schools or virtual schools or homeschool environments. We should have an environment where every kid, no matter what zip code, no matter what their parents' background, no matter where they came from, every kid in America should have access to a great education. And up until now, we haven't had that. One of the things I get frustrated with is that sometimes people like me who are deemed as conservatives are somehow told we don't care about education. I have 2 kids who came out of the public school system. I came out of the public school system. What I want more than anything, though, is a system that works for our kids, not just for the educational bureaucracy. And if we want to succeed, not just as a state or individual states, but as a country, we need to stand up and take note of that. Because if you look, about 2 months ago, there was a survey at Harvard, and you look at educational achievement and advancement over the last 18 years, Florida is one of those states near the top. Wisconsin, even though we have some of the top ACT scores, along with states like Iowa and others, was near the bottom. Why? Because for a lot of our states before governors like Jeb Bush came in place, a lot of our states have just been happy with being complacent. We've been in this cycle of denial. We haven't focused on the reality. In fact, when I mentioned this, it was just about the time of the Olympics when I spoke out at Harvard. I was kind of amazed at Harvard they let a guy like me come in without getting egged or tomatoed or something like that. But apparently there's at least a few right-of-center voices at Harvard. But they did this study where they looked at every state, and they looked at the top, I think it was about 150 industrialized nations across the globe. And they looked at the success rates out there, and they noted that even though states like mine are doing overall pretty well for the top achievers, that we hadn't done much to advance education reform. And I said the mindset that so many people have in America is, well, my schools are good because somebody told me that, because somewhere down the line I heard they were good, but they don't really measure it. And so they're complacent and they fall into denial. And I said, that's kind of like, if we look back to the Olympics this summer, it's kind of like being somebody who trained, who won a gold medal back in the 2008 Olympics and decided that, well, it's been a couple Olympics ago, or not 2008, even before that, 2004 Olympics, and thought, well, I trained, I got the gold medal, I don't need to train any differently for the 2012 Olympics. Well, times have changed. People are faster. They've used new technologies. There's new equipment. There's new ways to do things. And that's what we need to do when it comes to education. And one of the best ways to be able to do that is put the power in the hands of the people who educate at the local level, in our superintendents, and our school boards, and our principals, and most importantly, in our teachers. That's where we're allowed to make the difference out there. And I think that will have a tremendous impact, not just on education, but what it means for the future when it comes to our business and our economies here in Florida and Wisconsin and across America. Because that's the real challenge for us. If we see the kind of success all across America that we've seen in the last couple years here in Florida after some of that A+ plan for education, instead of being about 15th or 16th on the list as a country compared to other countries in terms of educational advancement, we'd be at the top. If all of our states were competing as well as the top 5 in terms of improvement all across America, our nation would be at the top. And more important than just being at the top in terms of a ranking or discipline or anything else of that matter, it's the fact of what it means to all of you as employers. One of our great challenges in each of our states as employers is not just the current economic crisis we're coming out of. That in of itself is significant. But one of the most significant things we have to tackle in the future is that our workforces are rapidly entering the phase where more and more baby boomers are in retirement age. The first wave is coming in, but it's quickly coming thereafter. That is both a challenge and an opportunity for us. The challenge is, if we don't address it, employers will go elsewhere. Because if you don't have enough quality, skilled employees, we already see it today in areas like advanced manufacturing and healthcare and other fields like that, but it'll be across the spectrum, anywhere in America if we don't tackle that. But it's also a great opportunity because if we get ahead of the curve, if we start putting a greater focus and a greater emphasis on making sure, not just in K through 12, but in our technical or community colleges and our four-year institutions, that we're plugging people into the skill sets that they need, we can dramatically reduce the unemployment rate in Florida and Wisconsin and all across America just by virtue of getting more people trained and put into those high-paying jobs because they have the skills to take those jobs on. That's what I know employers are telling me everywhere I go, not just in my state, but everywhere across America. And so having those sorts of reforms like the ones we did in Wisconsin to empower people who are in office at the local level for our school boards and who work in our technical and community colleges and to make those sorts of choices that aren't about huge bureaucracies, but instead are about empowering people to make the right decision, the powerful decisions, the reform-minded decisions that will make things happen. It's just incredibly, incredibly important. Let me just end with one last thought. And I appreciate you all giving me the chance. I didn't answer your question at the beginning. The reason I came here is simple. I was asked. I was asked to come on here. We met, as was mentioned, at the first year I was in as governor at this great session on with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. I was back again this year, and I'll go just about anywhere I've gotten a chance to tell our story, but not just because we want to talk about what we've done in Wisconsin, but more importantly, inspire others in different ways. And we want to learn, like I said, we learned from Jeb and others of some of the good things you've done here. We want to pass on some of the good things we've done in our state because we think competition's good. I was with Mike Pence yesterday, and I looked at his economic plan for Indiana as a candidate. One part was he wants to lower the income tax rate in his state by 10%. I told him it was great because I was going to go back to my legislature and said that means we need to lower it by 15% because we want to be competitive. And I think having particularly governors and leaders who are willing to be competitive in terms of creating a better business environment for all of our employees is a great thing. But ultimately, it takes courage. And I think if you don't remember anything else, the thing I'd like to leave you with tonight is an inspiration why I think not just in the coming elections, but after the elections, why it's so important to be engaged and supportive with the people you elect to office. And I'm not picking parties or anything else here tonight. If you want to ask me later, I'll tell you exactly who I think you should pick, but I'm not picking up here because I realize with the foundation and the chamber, that's not necessarily the role of tonight's gathering. But I will tell you this about why it's so important and why I ultimately knew we would prevail in our election on June 5th and why I think we're going to prevail not just state by state, but as a country after these elections are over in November. And it's simple. It's who we are as Americans. I knew we'd win our recall election because of what I looked at in our nation's history. I mentioned at the beginning our state's constitution and the history involved with that, but I went last September. I had a chance through the Governors Association to go to Philadelphia for the first time in my life. I grew up, as I mentioned, in a small town. My dad was a preacher. My brother and I didn't know until later in life when we went to college that we were poor. Because, in our case, even when we came down here, I think my dad drove straight through in a white Impala station wagon to get down to my grandparents' spot in Fort Myers so we could stay overnight. Other than that, we never made it out east because we rarely, if ever, stayed in a hotel. It was usually family or someone my dad knew from church we'd stay at, and that was about as far as we'd go on vacation. And so I'd never been to Philadelphia, but I loved history as a kid. In some ways, I'm kind of a geek. I used to think of studying history, I'd think of our founders almost like superheroes, bigger than life. So last year, I had a chance to go to Philadelphia for the first time in my life, and Tonette and I got up early one morning, went out with the National Park Service, went over to Independence Hall, not just to see on the way the Liberty Bell, but particularly to see Independence Hall itself. And if any of you have ever been there, both the place where the Declaration of Independence was at and where the Constitution was signed some 225 years ago last month, you realize the hall itself is not much bigger than the stage. As I stood in there and looked at that, I looked at the desk and the chairs. It dawned on me. These were ordinary people. Here I thought they were superheroes, and they were ordinary people because I looked at the chairs, and they're just like the chairs you're sitting here tonight. And it dawned on me these were ordinary people. ordinary people who did something quite extraordinary. They didn't just risk their political careers. They didn't just risk their business ventures. These were leaders who literally risked their lives for the freedoms we hold dear today. Ben Franklin had it right when he said at the time, we must all hang together or surely we'll hang separately. The reason why I believe we'll ultimately be successful in this country is because that's what we do as Americans. It's moments like that when I stood in Independence Hall and thought about the Constitution, thought about the Declaration of Independence, thought about other acts throughout our nation's history, that it makes you realize what has made America great, what has made us arguably the greatest country in the history of the world, what has made us exceptional is all throughout our nation's history. In times of crisis, be it economic or fiscal, be it military or spiritual, what has made this country amazing has been throughout that history, there have been men and women of courage who've been willing to stand up and think more about the future of their children and their grandchildren than they thought about their own political futures. Along the way, there have been men and women like you here tonight who've been willing to support them in those steps, encourage them, embolden them, and ensure that they continue down that path. I believe this is one of those times in our nation's history. I believe this is our moment to be engaged and where someday we can tell our children and grandchildren that we were there, we made a difference, we were in the game, we were the ones that helped turn around not only our states, but our country in a way that allowed them to inherit a greater America than the one we inherited ourselves. Thank you for letting me share here tonight.